I mean, I've written a number of papers. I got a certain amount of international recognition. I chaired Oxford and all the rest of it. But I think the real value of that has been the training in logic.
I don't have a PhD. I'm not a professor, let alone an Oxford professor. So I have no problem acknowledging John Lennox's academic accomplishments. He is obviously an intelligent and highly educated man, but Lennox is also setting a very high expectation here. He emphasizes his training in mathematics and logic, and immediately afterward, he begins presenting the mathematical structure of the universe as evidence for God. So the audience is being invited to expect a defense of Christianity grounded in careful reasoning. That is the standard Lennox himself is establishing. I am not imposing it on him. The question for the rest of this video is whether he actually meets that standard. Does he give us arguments and evidence that point specifically toward Christianity, or does the discussion eventually drift towards personal meaning, psychological comfort, and religious experience? We shall see.
My brothers are extremely good at maths. They're very rational thinking, maybe to a fault. And I think maybe I am a little bit too.
I am too.
I am too. I also consider myself a rational person, or at least someone who genuinely tries to follow the evidence wherever it leads. Some of my church friends used to tell me that I was too rational when I was still a Christian, and they didn't mean it as a compliment. In one sense, perhaps they were right. I eventually left Christianity because its claims no longer made sense to me, and because I no longer thought the available evidence justified believing them. So I am genuinely interested in seeing how Lennox uses rationality to defend Christianity. I spent more than 20 years as a Christian. I studied theology, served in ministry, preached the faith, and desperately wanted Christianity to be true. I did not leave because I disliked Jesus or wanted permission to sin. I stopped believing because Christianity no longer made sense. So when Lennox presents himself as someone who has rigorously interrogated Christianity for 70 years, I'm listening. Show me what I missed. Show me the evidence that makes Christianity the most rational conclusion. I mean that sincerely. If Lennox can provide compelling evidence, I'm not afraid of changing my mind.
I believe the Christian faith also claims rationality in the sense that evidence-based. We shout about that a lot in science and medicine, and rightly so. What we trust in ought to be evidence-based. I claim exactly the same thing for Christianity, and that's why I'm a Christian, because I believe the evidence supports it. Otherwise, I wouldn't.
Excellent. I agree with almost every word of that. What we trust ought to be evidence-based. Christianity makes factual claims about God, creation, Jesus, miracles, resurrection, judgment, heaven, and eternal life. Those claims should be judged by the evidence, not by how meaningful, comforting, or beautiful they sound. Lennox says that he is a Christian because the evidence supports Christianity, and that without that evidence, he would not believe it. That is a clear and testable standard. So this will be my central question throughout the rest of the video. What is the evidence, and how well does it distinguish Christianity from competing explanations? Not whether Christianity gives Lennox peace, not whether it gives prisoners hope, not whether it provides a bigger picture, not whether Christians can be kind, content, intelligent, or emotionally grounded. Those things may be personally valuable, but they do not establish that Jesus rose from the dead or that Christian God exists. Lennox has promised us an evidence-based case. Let's examine what he actually delivers. Hello, my friends. This is Shen from Mindful Living. Welcome to the channel, and thank you for tuning in. This channel is about thinking critically about important issues, especially religion, an area where people are often discouraged from questioning what they have been taught. My goal is to help all of us become more mindful, not only of what we think, but also of how we arrive at our conclusions. If that interests you, please subscribe so you don't miss future videos. Alright, let's get back to John Lennox.
And you've probably noticed it too, the number of intellectuals who are step by step taking the Christian faith more seriously as giving a rational account of what's going on.
That sounds impressive, but it's also extremely vague. Which intellectuals? How many? Compared with what period? Are we talking about a measurable trend, or does Lennox simply know several intellectual Christians and feel that something is changing? The graphic displayed by the host Steven Bartlett points in the opposite direction. According to the graphic, only 7% of elite scientists or academicians believe in God or a higher power, while 72% are classified as atheists or non-believers. Now, that does not prove atheism is true. Truth is not determined by taking a vote among scientists, but Lennox is the one making a sociological claim about intellectuals increasingly taking Christianity seriously. If he wants that claim to carry any weight, he needs to provide evidence for the trend rather than simply announcing that he has noticed one. And even if some intellectuals are becoming Christians, that still would not tell us whether their reasons are good. Intelligent people convert to Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, and every other major religion. Intelligent people also leave those religions. So appealing to an unspecified collection of intellectuals does not establish that intellectuals have been gradually taking Christianity more seriously. Even if it were true, it still doesn't establish that Christianity gives the best rational account of reality. We still need to hear the actual account and examine the evidence supporting it.
We've had pushed at us for too long a very reductionist view of the world. It's nothing but physics and chemistry. It's nothing but this or that. And people rightly feel it's too small a world to live in.
Wait, what? Notice the change in language. A moment ago, we were talking about intellectuals giving a rational account of reality. Now we are talking about what people feel is too small a world to live in. To be fair, Lennox might merely be describing why people are becoming dissatisfied with a reductionistic worldview. He may not yet be saying that their dissatisfaction proves Christianity is true, but dissatisfaction is not evidence. Feeling that a purely physical universe is cold, small, or meaningless tells us something about human psychology. It does not tell us what the universe actually contains. I might feel that the universe ought to guarantee me eternal life. I might feel that justice demands an afterlife. I might feel that my life must have some cosmic purpose. Those feelings are understandable, but reality is under no obligation to satisfy them. A hunch can motivate us to investigate. It cannot substitute for the investigation. And rejecting crude reductionism would not automatically get us to Christianity anyway. There are many alternatives. One could believe in emergent properties, non-reductive physicalism, idealism, panpsychism, deism, some impersonal cosmic consciousness, or countless other possibilities. Even if nothing but physics and chemistry were inadequate, Christianity would not win by default.
They're looking to break out of this. Isn't there a bigger picture that can make sense of my world and make sense of my life and giving some meaning?
Of course, people want a bigger picture. People want their lives to matter. They want death not to be the end. They want suffering to be redeemed, evil to be punished, and the people they love to continue existing. Christianity offers answers to all of those desires. That helps explain why Christianity can be emotionally powerful. But explaining why a belief is attractive is not the same as demonstrating that it is true. A religion can give someone meaning, peace, community, hope, forgiveness, and a reason to get out of bed in the morning. All of that can be psychologically real, even if the religion's supernatural claims are false. This is an important distinction that will become increasingly relevant as the interview continues. There's a difference between saying Christianity gives me a meaningful way to interpret my life and saying the evidence shows that Christianity is factually true. The first is a statement about Christianity's psychological and existential effects. The second is a claim about reality. Lennox repeatedly tells us that he is making the second claim, so he cannot support it merely by describing the benefits of the first.
Because if you reduce everything, it ends up in a black hole of meaninglessness. And that's one of my top reasons for not being an atheist, because it destroys rationality almost by definition.
Hold on. Lennox has just spent the previous minute saying that people find a purely physical universe too small and are searching for a bigger picture that gives their lives meaning. He then says this is one of his top reasons for not being an atheist. But when he explains what he means, his argument shifts. He does not actually say that he rejects atheism because it leads to meaninglessness. He says he rejects it because, in his view, atheism undermines rationality. At the very least, he's sliding between two completely different objections. The first is existential. Atheism supposedly makes life meaningless. The second is epistemological. Atheism supposedly destroys rationality. Let's look at the first one. Disliking the implications of a worldview does not show that the worldview is false. Even if atheism made every human being miserable, lonely, and terrified of death, that would tell us nothing about whether God actually exists. Reality does not become false because we find it emotionally unsatisfying. This distinction matters because Lennox has repeatedly told us that Christianity is evidence-based. Yet here, one of his top reasons for rejecting atheism begins with the feeling that a physical universe is too small and meaningless. That is not evidence against atheism. That is an emotional reaction to atheism. But then Lennox says atheism actually destroys rationality. That is his second point. Alright, that sounds like a genuine argument. So how does he defend it?
Because it tells me that my brain, which does all the thinking, it's not my mind, it's connected, and those are two different things, and that's another big story. But this is the end product of a mindless, unguided process. And I have fun with scientists, sometimes. I ask them about the brain and how it arose, and they tell me something like that. And I said, and you trust it? Tell me, if the computer that you use every day, if you knew it was the end product of a random process, would you trust it? Every single scientist, and some of them are very high-powered, that I've asked that question to have said, no, I would not. So I say, you've got a problem, haven't you? Your atheism goes too far. It undermines the very rationality we need to do science, let alone to believe in atheism.
What Lennox is presenting here resembles the evolutionary argument against naturalism, famously developed by the Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga. But Plantinga's argument is considerably more sophisticated than what Lennox gives us here. Plantinga does not simply say evolution is random, therefore you cannot trust your brain. He argues that if both naturalism and evolution are true, then the probability that our cognitive faculties are reliable may be low, or at least impossible to determine, because natural selection rewards survival-enhancing behavior rather than true beliefs. Whether Plantinga's argument succeeds is a separate question. Lennox gives us a much cruder version. His argument appears to be evolution is random. A randomly produced computer would be unreliable. Therefore, an evolved brain would also be unreliable. But evolution is not simply one gigantic random process. Mutations are often described as random, but natural selection is not random. Organisms possessing traits that improve survival and reproduction are more likely to pass those traits on. That does not mean evolution is consciously aiming toward improvement. There is no engineer planning the process, but it also does not mean brains were assembled in one random accident, like a tornado passing through a junkyard and producing a computer. Lennox's computer analogy leaves out the most important part, selection. Imagine computers that produce variations of themselves, and are repeatedly tested by their environments. Computers that cannot process relevant information fail to reproduce, while those that process it more effectively continue producing descendants. After countless generations of variation and selection, would we expect the surviving computers to remain no more reliable than objects assembled through a single random accident? Obviously not. A creature that consistently misperceives cliffs, predators, food, shelter, and potential mates is not likely to survive very long. The ability to form broadly accurate representations of the environment is generally useful for survival. Truth and survival are not mutually exclusive. Now, this does not mean our cognitive faculties must be perfect. Evolution does not need to produce flawless logicians. It only needs to produce organisms whose cognitive systems work well enough to survive and reproduce. That helps explain why our minds can be generally reliable while also containing systematic biases. Imagine one of our ancestors see movement in the bushes. He assumes there is a lion and runs away, but it turns out to be nothing more than the wind. He has committed a false positive error, but the cost is small. Now imagine the opposite. He assumes it is only the wind, but it is actually a lion. That false negative error could cost him his life. When the cost of the two mistakes are radically unequal, evolution can favor a bias toward making the less costly mistake. This is usually discussed under error management theory, sometimes called the smoke detector principle. A smoke detector that occasionally goes off when you burn toast is irritating, but a smoke detector that remains silent during a real fire is useless. When this oversensitivity involves detecting agents, intentions, or predators, it can also be described as hyperactive agency detection. So it's true that evolution can produce cognitive biases, but those biases do not show that our brains are completely unreliable. They show that cognition is adapted to practical environments, with trade-offs between speed, accuracy, energy use, and the unequal costs of different mistakes, and the existence of confirmation bias, anchoring, pattern recognition errors, memory distortions, and motivated reasoning fits quite naturally with the idea that our brains evolved for survival rather than being created as perfect truth-detecting machines. That does not prove evolution by itself, but it certainly does not create the devastating problem for naturalism that Lennox thinks it does. And appealing to God does not magically solve the problem. Our minds are as reliable or unreliable as they actually are, regardless of the story we tell about their origin. Saying that an all-powerful God designed the human mind does not remove confirmation bias, false memories, hallucinations, in-group, out-group bias, or motivated reasoning. In fact, theism creates its own question. If a perfectly rational God carefully designed our cognitive faculties for discovering truth, why are those faculties so vulnerable to systematic error? Why do equally sincere people use those supposedly God-designed minds to reach incompatible conclusions about Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Mormonism, and countless other religions? Theism cannot simply declare that our faculties are trustworthy because God designed them. It must explain the actual imperfections we observe. And religion is one of the clearest places where these imperfections appear. John Lennox repeatedly says that his Christianity is evidence-based, but throughout this interview, when Steven Bartlett asks him for the evidence, Lennox repeatedly returns to personal experiences, inner peace, forgiveness, meaning, transformed prisoners, trusting God like he trusts his wife, stepping into the water, and asking God to reveal himself. Those things may be emotionally powerful, they may be psychologically transformative, but they are not the kind of public, independently verifiable evidence that would establish Christianity as true, rather than Islam, Mormonism, Hinduism, or some non-religious psychological explanations. I think Bartlett recognizes this problem. That is not the kind of answer he is looking for, so he directly challenges Lennox to convince him, while also warning him that merely appealing to the Bible will not work.
I would love you to convince me. I mean, it's not your responsibility to do so, but where does that journey of believing begin for someone like me? Because, you know, people say the Bible, and I go, well, it's kind of like what you said about the computers. It's like, if you're using something to justify the same thing is true,
Yes.
then that circular reasoning I find to be incomplete. Because I could write on this piece of paper, Steven Bartlett is a lizard.
Yes.
And this piece of paper is true. And then you then use that same piece of paper to justify the validity of that same piece of paper.
Mm-hmm.
And I go, well,
got
that's
yes.
not solid reasoning.
Bartlett could hardly have made the objection clearer. Do not simply tell me that Christianity is true because the Christian scriptures say it is true. Give me some reason to trust those scriptures in the first place. And then Lennox responds like this.
It seems to me one of the things to try to begin to grasp is God is not a proposition or a philosophy or even a religion. God is a person. As a person, he has entered our world, however incredible that may seem.
But that is the very claim Bartlett is asking him to justify. How does Lennox know that God is a person? How does he know that this God entered the world as Jesus? He simply states the Christian conclusions as if it were already established. That is not yet an argument. It is a repetition of the belief that needs evidence.
You know, I'm waiting for the biggest uploading that's ever going to happen in history when Christ returns and raises me from the dead, because that is precisely what he promises.
Again, where is the evidence that Christ will return? Where is the evidence that Christ made this promise, can fulfill it, or will raise Lennox from the dead? Where is the evidence for this afterlife at all? The apparent basis is the New Testament, but Bartlett has just explained why scriptural claims cannot simply authenticate themselves. Instead of addressing that problem, Lennox continues speaking as though the promises recorded in Christian scripture are already known to be genuine promises from God. Then we get this.
Christianity, to me, doesn't compete with anything else, because Christ offers me something nobody else offers me. Nobody else offers me peace. The peace of knowing that I have real forgiveness. The peace of knowing that I have a friend and a companion to whom I can talk all the time. That's been so meaningful in my life, as I spell out in detail in my autobiography. And the peace of having been given a new life that will not end when I die.
But the fact that Christianity gives Lennox peace does not show that Christianity is true. A Muslim may feel peace through submission to Allah. A Latter-day Saint may feel that the Holy Spirit confirms the Book of Mormon. A Hindu may experience a divine presence during prayer. People in different religions report forgiveness, guidance, companionship, transformation, and certainty. Those experiences cannot all verify their incompatible theological beliefs. So when Lennox says he has the peace of knowing that he is forgiven, that he has a divine companion, and that his life will continue after death, the question remains, how does he know? What evidence shows that God is concerned with Lennox's wrongdoing and has forgiven him? What evidence shows that the person Lennox talks to is an independently existing divine being rather than an internal psychological experience? What evidence shows that Lennox has been given a life that will continue after his body dies? Calling it peace tells us how the belief makes him feel. It does not tell us whether the belief corresponds to reality.
I think everybody, especially in a world that's getting increasingly lonely and disconnected and isolated for many reasons, is looking for that secure relationship.
They are.
They're looking for their own, a home that can't fall down.
Yes. Yes, and a peace that doesn't fade, and an inheritance that doesn't. Exactly. You're dead right.
If I could choose that, if I could press a button and have it, I would have it. But there's this other part of my brain which will naturally interrogate whether it's real. Or it's true.
You're absolutely right.
Once again, Bartlett clearly distinguishes between wanting Christianity to be true and having good reasons to believe it is true. He understands the emotional appeal. He would love to have an unbreakable relationship, lasting peace, and eternal life, but he's asking whether any of it is real. So how does Lennox answer that request for justification?
I've made myself totally vulnerable. That's why I got into all the debates with new atheists and all the rest of it, because I want to be sure. But it won't come about by pressing a button. It will come about if you're open enough to say, God, I'm open. Reveal yourself to me, and I'm prepared to take the steps that I feel are leading me onto solid ground. I do not believe that this is a process of taking a leap into the dark, but it's making a commitment on the basis of what you know already and taking a step further forward. And the interesting thing about this is the trust that's at the heart of everything.
So much for the promised evidence-based case. Bartlett asks, How do I know it's true? Lennox tells him to open himself to God, ask God to reveal himself, and begin taking steps of commitment and trust. But trust cannot answer the question of whether the person being trusted exists. Before I trust someone, I need some reason to believe that there is actually someone there. Asking God to reveal himself may be a personal experiment, but it is not the public evidence Lennox seemed to promise at the beginning of the interview. People in many religions pray sincerely, feel guided, experience peace, and interpret events as divine responses. That method does not reliably distinguish Christianity from competing religions or from psychological processes. Lennox insists that this is not a leap into the dark because the commitment is supposedly based on what someone already knows. But Bartlett is asking him what that prior knowledge consists of. What has already been established? What evidence gets us from Jesus existed to Jesus is God, rose from the dead, hears my prayers, forgives my sins, and will raise me after death? Lennox does not explain that here. Instead, he moves from evidence to commitment before establishing the claims on which that commitment depends. I'm disappointed because Lennox sets a very different expectation at the beginning. He emphasized mathematics, logic, rationality, and evidence. But when Bartlett finally asks him how to know Christianity is true, the answer becomes, be open, ask God to reveal himself, and begin trusting. That is faith. Lennox may call it evidence-based trust, but he still has to show us the evidence.
I trust my wife. I've been married to her for 58 years this year. It's evidence-based trust. I don't trust her for no reason. And the same is true of my friends, as will be the case with you. Evidence-based trust in science and in Christian things.
But the analogy with his wife fails at the most important point. We already have overwhelming evidence that Lennox's wife exists. He can show us photographs, introduce us to her, produce legal records of their marriage, and invite other people who know her to confirm her existence. More importantly, Lennox interacts with her directly and repeatedly. She speaks to him, responds to him, shares a home with him, and behaves in publicly observable ways. Only after her existence and their relationship are established does the question of trust arise. But God is the very person whose existence is being questioned. Bartlett is not asking, given that the Christian God exists, should I trust him? He is asking, how do I know that this God exists at all? Saying you should trust God as I trust my wife skips over the question. It assumes the existence and identity of the person who is supposed to be trusted. Many people genuinely seek God, pray for guidance, study Christianity, and remain unconvinced. Some spend years asking God to reveal himself and receive no clear answer. That does not prove that no God exists, but it is difficult to reconcile with Lennox's picture of a God who desires a personal relationship with everyone and reveals himself to those who are sincerely open. At the very least, God does not show up with anything close to the clarity and consistency of Lennox's wife. So the analogy does not support his argument. It highlights the problem of divine hiddenness. Some kind of God might exist, but if that God remains indistinguishable from absence for many sincere seekers, Lennox cannot simply assume that the problem is their unwillingness to trust. I think Bartlett shares this frustration because after listening to Lennox describe grace, forgiveness, peace, and relationship for several minutes, he brings the conversation back to the unanswered question.
That was a really beautiful description and definition of what the Christian faith is about. It still leaves me with a question about whether it's true. And this is the sort of central question that I need to find my way over.
Yeah, I agree with you. Absolutely.
And this is, I find myself often, I've sat with a few like Christian apologists and asked them similar questions about like, how do I know if it's true?
Bartlett politely acknowledges that Lennox has given a beautiful description of Christianity, but beauty is not what he asked for. He still does not know whether any of it is true. So Lennox finally says that he has two approaches, one objective and one subjective.
I have two approaches to this, which I call, roughly speaking, objective and subjective. And it depends entirely where someone's coming from. They may start very far back and say, look, we read about this chap Jesus. How do we know he ever existed? Well, then you go to the ancient historians and you find that most of them, whether they're atheists or not, believe that he existed and so on.
I accept that he existed.
Yes.
Yeah.
As far as I can tell, that is the only point where Lennox explicitly appeals to an ordinary scholarly consensus that can be checked independently. Historians generally accept that Jesus existed. Fine, I accept that too. But the existence of Jesus is not the central disputed claim. Historians also accept the existence of Muhammad, Joseph Smith, and many other religious founders. Establishing that a preacher named Jesus lived in 1st century Palestine does not establish that he was God, performed miracles, rose from the dead, hears prayers, forgives sins, or will return to raise Lennox from the grave. Those are the claims Bartlett once justified. Yet Lennox does not proceed from the relatively modest historical claim that Jesus existed to the much larger theological claims Christianity makes about him. He does not explain what evidence establishes the resurrection or why the New Testament should be trusted regarding Jesus' divine identity. Instead, he returns to Thomas, personal openness, stepping into the water, and continuing to ask questions.
You know, some of the disciples, when Jesus rose from the dead, they just didn't believe the story. Ridiculous. And there's a famous story of Thomas, who said to the others, he said, unless I see the marks in his hands and so on, I won't believe. And then Jesus stood among them. And he didn't make fun of Thomas's objective. He said, Thomas, come and have a look. You never know what swimming is until you get into the water. Isn't that true?
It is true.
And all I can say is that step by step, keep asking your questions.
You know what is sad about this exchange? Bartlett is already doing exactly what Lennox tells him to do. He's sitting there asking sincere, direct questions, trying to understand what evidence supports Christianity. Yet the number one Christian expert, according to Bartlett, responds by telling him to keep asking questions, almost as though he has not noticed that this is precisely what Bartlett has been doing throughout the interview. In fact, Lennox's story about Thomas makes the problem worse. According to the gospel story, Thomas was given exactly the kind of evidence Bartlett is requesting. Jesus appeared in front of him and invited him to examine his wounds. Thomas did not have to believe first and hope that Jesus would eventually reveal himself. He supposedly received direct, physical evidence. Bartlett is not being offered anything comparable. He is being told to keep asking questions and step into the water. The disputed question is whether there is actually a supernatural person waiting to catch you. You cannot answer that by saying, jump in and trust that he's there. That assumes the very thing Bartlett is asking Lennox to establish. It also creates an unreliable method for discovering truth. Christians tell people to open themselves to Jesus. Muslims tell people to submit to Allah and experience the truth of Islam. Latter-day Saints tell people to pray about the Book of Mormon and wait for a spiritual confirmation. Different religions invite people to make a commitment first and then interpret their later experiences through that commitment. That method can produce sincere certainty. It cannot reliably tell us which religion, if any, is true. At this point, Bartlett stops pressing that exact question and asks Lennox about his personal journey. How did Lennox himself become so certain? And once again, the answer is personal experience.
And so, in my simple way, I responded as a child. I didn't have any great feelings or anything else. But what happened to me as I grew, and especially as I went to university in Cambridge, and I decided, look, I really believe this stuff is true. I'm going to stand for it. And it was when I began to stand and share with others that a great deal of the underpinning came in and the certainty came. Cumulatively, not all a big, I've never had these big flashes of anything, but I have had several experiences of what I can only put down to direct divine guidance, and I record them in the book.
Notice the sequence Lennox describes. He already believed Christianity was true. He decided to stand for it and share it with other people. Then over time, he interpreted certain experiences as divine guidance, and those experiences increased his certainty. But that sequence creates an obvious risk of confirmation bias. Once someone is committed to a belief, they naturally begin interpreting ambiguous events through that belief. A Christian has an unexpected experience and attributes it to Jesus. A Muslim attributes it to Allah. A Hindu attributes it to Krishna or another deity. A Latter-day Saint attributes it to the Holy Spirit, confirming the restored gospel. Dr. Lennox, you do know that perceived divine guidance is not unique to Christianity, right? People in virtually every religion report guidance, answered prayer, meaningful coincidences, peace, supernatural experiences, and a sense that God is directing their lives. Many of them are just as sincere and certain as you are. So how did Lennox determine that his experiences came from the Christian God rather than his own expectations, selective memory, coincidence, or ordinary psychological processes? How did he rule out the experiences reported by followers of competing religions? Saying, I can only put it down to divine guidance is not an argument. It is a hunch, an interpretation at best. We need to know why that interpretation is better than the alternatives. A personal experience may count as evidence for the person who has it, but its evidential value depends on how clearly it identifies its cause. If the same kinds of experiences regularly produce incompatible religious conclusions, they are weak evidence for any one religion in particular. The next subject makes this problem even clearer.
Globally, 91% of adults simply adopt and keep the religion they were raised in. Mm-hmm. And if a person is born into a Hindu or Muslim household, there is a 99% statistical probability they will remain in that faith. Only 1% switch out. Mm-hmm. And then the argument, I think it came from Dawkins or someone else, was that, is it fair that there's this birth lottery determining who ends up believing what, or theoretically getting into hell or heaven?
Yes.
Because if I was born in, I don't know, Afghanistan, the probability says I'd probably be Muslim.
This is an important question. Our religious beliefs are strongly influenced by where we are born, what our parents believe, and which religion dominates our surrounding culture. Had Lennox been born into a Muslim family in Afghanistan, he would probably have grown up hearing testimonies about Allah, trusting the Quran, and interpreting experiences as Islamic divine guidance. Had he been born in India, he might have interpreted similar experiences through Hinduism. That does not prove that every religion is false, but it does show that religious certainty is heavily shaped by cultural transmission. And that creates a serious problem for anyone claiming that one particular religion is clearly revealed by a God who wants everyone to know him. Lennox initially responded with a story about Peter Singer. Singer was raised by atheist parents, so Lennox jokes that Singer remained in the faith in which he was raised. But that does not answer Bartlett's question. Perhaps atheist parents also influence their children. Fine. That actually reinforces the larger point. People's beliefs are strongly influenced by their upbringing. The question is not whether atheists are immune to cultural influence. The question is why belief in the allegedly one true religion depends so heavily on the accidents of birthplace. And pointing to one person who converted from Judaism to Christianity does not answer a population-level pattern. Exceptions do not erase the overall geographical distribution. To Lennox's credit, he eventually admits that his story does not answer the question. But when he finally responds directly, this is what he says.
Is there anywhere evidence enough to trust God with that situation? That's a hard question.
And by that you mean the situation of the sort of geographical distribution of belief?
Yes, we'll never understand it or solve it.
But do we trust God?
Do we trust God ultimately to be absolutely fair? Because if God isn't fair in the end, he knows what everybody thinks, I believe. And we'll be surprised maybe, at what he does, because he can measure how much people know.
And there is the move again. The observation is that religious belief tracks geography and upbringing. That is exactly what we would expect if religions spread primarily through families, communities, and cultures. But instead of asking whether that pattern is evidence against a God who wants everyone to know the same truth, Lennox changes the question. Now, the question is no longer why does the evidence look as though religious belief is culturally transmitted. It becomes, can we trust God to deal fairly with the situation? But saying that God will judge everyone fairly does not explain why a person's religious beliefs are so predictable from geography. It does not explain why sincere seekers reach contradictory religious conclusions. And it does not provide evidence that this fair God exists in the first place. Lennox simply assumes that God exists, that God knows everyone's thoughts, that God is fair, and that God has morally sufficient reason for allowing the pattern we observe. Then he tells us to trust that God will eventually sort it out. But this looks more like a way of insulating the belief from the evidence than an evidence-based answer. If the evidence looks exactly as Christianity predicts, that supports God. If the evidence looks unexpected under Christianity, God must have reasons we do not understand. If God appears to reveal himself, that supports God. If God remains hidden, we must trust that his hiddenness has a purpose. If Christianity spreads everywhere, that supports God's desire to reach humanity. If religion remains largely determined by geography, God will somehow judge everyone fairly. What possible observation could ever count against the hypothesis? Lennox seems to be framing belief in God in a way that makes it effectively unfalsifiable.
I think it was actually Ricky Gervais tell the story of the baby being born in, let's say it's Africa or somewhere else, or India or wherever it might be, the UK, who is born with a parasite eating its eyeball out from the inside.
I know this, yeah.
And I remember hearing that when I was 18.
Yeah, terrible.
And thinking, okay, so if God's all-knowing, he knew that that baby was going to have its eye eaten out by a parasite before the baby was born, but allowed the baby to be born anyway. And with my moral compass, I would have intervened.
Exactly. Why would an all-powerful and loving God allow something so horrifying when he could prevent it effortlessly? This does not logically prove that no God exists. Perhaps some indifferent or limited God exists, but it is certainly evidence against the particular God Lennox is defending, a God who is perfectly loving, knows everything in advance, and has unlimited power to intervene. So how does Lennox answer?
My question that I set out a few minutes ago, is there any evidence anywhere that God, you can trust God with it? And the major piece of evidence, to my mind, is the cross of Christ. And if Christ really is God, whom he claimed to be, this is God's suffering. And why is God suffering? Well, it certainly tells me that he hasn't remained distant from human suffering, but has himself become part of it. Now, that's not an answer. There are no simplistic answers here.
No, it is not an answer. Lennox even admits that. Suppose for the sake of argument that Jesus was God and that God experienced suffering on the cross. That might show that God is willing to participate in human suffering, but it still does not explain why God allowed this child to suffer in the first place. God suffering alongside the child is not the same as God having a morally sufficient reason to let the parasite eat the child's eye. Imagine that I could effortlessly stop someone from torturing a child, but I chose not to. Later, I deliberately injured myself to show that I was willing to share in the child's pain. Would that justify my failure to intervene? Of course not. The question would still be, why did you allow the child to suffer when you could have stopped it? The cross and the prevention of suffering are not alternatives. God could send Jesus to die on the cross and also prevent the parasites from eating the child's eye. There's no trade-off here. It's not as though God had to choose between saving humanity from sin and saving this child from a parasite. So appealing to the cross may provide emotional comfort, but it does not answer the evidential problem. Then Lennox makes the same move we saw earlier.
But you see, once you remove God, that child, there's no hope for it. It's dead, gone, out, nothing. But suppose God can compensate that child because he has the power to raise from the dead as he did with Jesus. That changes everything for me.
First, saying that without God, the child has no hope does not show that God exists. That is another appeal to the emotional consequences of atheism. Perhaps we desperately want the child to receive another life. I certainly understand that desire, but wanting compensation does not provide evidence that compensation will occur. And notice Lennox's wording.
Suppose God can compensate that child.
Suppose. This is the evidence-based case we were promised. A child experiences unimaginable suffering, and when that suffering appears inconsistent with an all-powerful and loving God, Lennox introduces an unverifiable future compensation. Maybe God will make it right in heaven. Maybe the child will receive such a wonderful afterlife that the earthly suffering will somehow be overcome. But compensation is not the same thing as justification. If I deliberately allow someone to suffer when I could easily prevent it, promising them a reward afterward does not automatically make my original decision morally acceptable. We would still ask why the suffering had to happen at all. And in this case, Lennox has not shown that it had to happen. He has not identified some greater good that required the parasite to eat the child's eye. He merely imagines that God might compensate the child afterward. Here is an alternative idea. God could prevent the parasites from eating the child's eye and still give the child a wonderful life in heaven. Again, there is no necessary trade-off. It is not as though the child must suffer horribly on earth to qualify for happiness in the afterlife. Lennox's answer therefore does not explain why God allowed the suffering. It simply adds another unverified claim to protect the original belief. The evidence appears inconsistent with the loving and all-powerful God, so Lennox responds that perhaps there is another world where God will compensate everyone, but we cannot observe that world. We cannot verify the compensation. We cannot ask the child whether it happened. That is the problem. Any amount of suffering can now be accommodated by the hypothesis. No matter what happens, the answer is always that God will eventually make it right, somewhere beyond our ability to investigate. That may preserve his faith, but it is not an evidence-based explanation of the suffering. It is a speculation-based rescue of the hypothesis.
And you see, C.S. Lewis has helped me a lot. I used to listen to him. I'm that old. He has helped me a lot in this idea of a sense in which there's more than one world. And we're so conditioned to thinking that this world is the only one there is. But if there is another world, and there is a loving God...
Those are two enormous ifs.
Then I suspect, I can't prove this to you, but when we one day see and enter that world, and see what God has done with the kind of child you mentioned, we'll have no more questions.
What is special about C.S. Lewis here? He was a gifted writer, but he did not speak for God. His ability to imagine another world does not give us evidence that another world actually exists. And even granting an afterlife for the sake of argument, how would that justify allowing a parasite to eat a child's eye in this world? Future compensation does not automatically explain why the suffering was permitted when it could have been prevented. And notice the language. I suspect, and I can't prove this to you. That is an honest admission, but it also exposes the problem. Lennox is asking us to use an unverifiable afterlife to neutralize evidence against a loving God in the present world. He is essentially saying that although the suffering looks difficult to reconcile with a loving and all-powerful God now, perhaps after we die, we will discover information that makes everything understandable. But until that happens, we do not possess that information. So why are we expected to believe the conclusion in advance? If Lennox says that we must wait until the afterlife to see how God compensated the child, then surely it is reasonable for us to withhold belief until we see that evidence. He cannot appeal to evidence that is supposedly available only after death and then criticize people for remaining unconvinced while they are still alive. And even if we eventually discover that the child received a wonderful afterlife, the original question remains: why did the child have to endure that suffering at all? God could have prevented the parasite and still given the child eternal happiness. Once again, there is no necessary trade-off.
So you think he's compensated that child?
Oh, yes.
There goes the evidence-based reasoning. Lennox begins with two assumptions: that a loving God exists and that another world exists. He then concludes that God must compensate the child there. The compensation is not independently established. It is inferred from the assumed goodness of the God, whose goodness is precisely what the suffering has called into question. It is obvious by now that Lennox's faith isn't evidence-based. So my question to him is this: why present your faith as evidence-based? In this interview, Lennox gives us no independent evidence that another world exists. He gives us no independent evidence that victims are compensated after death. He gives us no clear arguments establishing that a perfectly loving God exists. He does not establish that Jesus' death provides salvation or that Jesus will return and raise believers from the dead. He repeatedly states these things because Christianity teaches them, and then describes the peace and meaning he receives from believing them. Within this interview, the only claim he explicitly grounds in ordinary historical scholarship is that Jesus existed. Fine, I accept that Jesus existed, but that does not establish Christianity. Existence is not divinity. A historical preacher is not automatically God incarnate, and a meaningful religious story is not automatically an evidence-based account of reality. Lennox promised logic, rationality, and evidence, but when confronted with hard questions, his answer is ultimately: assume that God is loving, trust that another world exists, and believe that everything will make sense later. That is faith. It may be comforting faith, sincere faith, and sophisticated faith, but calling it evidence-based does not make it so.
What about all the humans that lived before Jesus came?
Well, God will never judge anybody for not knowing what they didn't know.
I may sound like a broken record by now, but Dr. Lennox, how do you know that? Where is the evidence that God judges people according to how much religious information was available to them? Is this something God has demonstrated, or is it simply what Lennox thinks a fair and loving God ought to do? It certainly makes the problem feel less troubling, but a comforting theological solution is not automatically a true one. Once again, Lennox confidently tells us what God thinks and what God will do without first establishing that this God exists or that Lennox has reliable access to his policies.
Is it important that I believe in God? Like, if I live a good life, I'm kind to people and I do my best.
But you see, that's exactly the point I was making. That people think that living a good life and being kind to people is what God is interested in. When God is prepared for us a relationship with himself through Christ that deals with the forgiveness of sins that we all need.
Let's pay attention to what is happening here. Bartlett asks whether belief in God is necessary if he already lives a good life and treats people kindly. Lennox's answer shifts the focus away from how we treat other people and toward our supposed need for forgiveness and a relationship with God through Christ. It's clear that in his framework, being kind to other people is not enough. What ultimately matters is accepting the Christian account of sin, forgiveness, and salvation. But why should we accept that framework? Lennox has not established that all human beings are guilty before God and require supernatural forgiveness. He has not established that Jesus' death provides that forgiveness, and he has not established that entering this relationship is more important than living compassionately and reducing harm. He simply assumes the entire Christian diagnosis and cure. We are sinners. We need forgiveness. Christ provides it, and salvation depends on accepting that relationship. That helps explain why Lennox repeatedly returns to forgiveness, peace, security, companionship, and eternal life. These are the things Christianity gives him personally, but describing how well a religion meets his emotional and existential needs is not the same as showing that its claims are true. And this leads directly to the next problem. People in other religions also report finding meaning, peace, forgiveness, and fulfillment. If Lennox treats those experiences as support for Christianity, shouldn't the same reasoning also support their religions?
And it seems to be the case that really irrespective of which religion fills that place in your life, you still get the same boost in meaning post starting to believe.
Well, I'm not convinced of that, you see, because I'm sitting here as a Christian and I've reason for being a Christian because I don't find this need met in those practitioners of other religions. I don't find that sense of fulfillment and peace that comes through the forgiveness in Christ.
Unbelievable. Bartlett points out that people in different religions report the same kinds of benefits, meaning, peace, fulfillment, and psychological security. Lennox responds that he is not convinced because he personally do not find their religions capable of meeting the need in the way Christianity does. Dr. Lennox, really? How on earth do you know that? You are not the person having their experiences. How can you determine from the outside that a devout Muslim, Hindu, or Buddhist does not experience the same depth of peace and fulfillment that you experience as a Christian? You seem to privilege your own internal experience while discounting the testimony of people whose experiences support different religions. But Bartlett does not let Lennox off so easily. He pushes the point further and ironically responds with actual evidence.
But when I look at the stats here, data shows that devout Muslims and a devout Hindu get the exact same psychological meaning boost and sense of peace as a devout Christian.
Well, how do you measure that?
Well, they ask them, is your life more meaningful? And sometimes I've got one particular friend who's part of his, evidence that what he believes is true is the feeling he got when he started believing it.
Yeah, well,
but the data suggests that.
That if it is true, a positive feeling would reinforce that, of course, but it doesn't prove it in the end.
Exactly. A positive feeling does not prove one's belief to be true. A Muslim's peace does not prove Islam. A Hindu's sense of meaning does not prove Hinduism. A Latter-day Saint's spiritual experience does not prove the Book of Mormon. But then Lennox's peace, fulfillment, and sense of forgiveness do not prove Christianity either. That is the inconsistency. Throughout the interview, Lennox repeatedly presents the peace and meaning he receives from Christianity as part of his reason for believing. But as soon as Bartlett points out that other religions produce similar experiences, Lennox correctly says that positive feelings do not prove the belief is true. That's double standards.
It seems to be the case that the Bible suggests that if you don't believe in God, even if you lived a good life, you go to hell. And hell is described as not a nice place.
We paint hell as something ogre-like, God stuffing and demons stuffing bodies into hell, when actually, I think Lewis got it right here.
There is C.S. Lewis again, but saying that Lewis got it right does not establish that hell exists or that Lewis accurately described it.
You know, when he talks about this, that hell is absence of God and it's chosen. If a person doesn't want God in their life, and I've known people like that, and they choose it, God will give them what they chose. Otherwise, God is going to have to force his way into their lives and they don't want him.
This is not a fair description of most non-believers. Most skeptics are not saying, I know that Christian God exists and he is a very loving and gentle God. I know heaven is real and hell is terrible, but I deliberately choose hell. They are saying, I do not see sufficient evidence that this God, heaven or hell, exists. Those are completely different positions. You cannot choose a relationship with someone you sincerely do not believe exists. If I tell you that an invisible person wants to be your friend, but you see no convincing evidence that this person is real, your lack of belief is not the same thing as deliberately rejecting the friendship and revealing himself would not mean God was forcing himself into anyone's life. Lennox's wife can clearly reveal that she exists without forcing Lennox to love or trust her. Likewise, God could make his existence unmistakably clear while still allowing people to decide whether they want a relationship with him. Knowledge does not eliminate freedom. Claiming that non-believers choose hell shifts responsibility away from a God who remains hidden and puts it on people who are honestly unconvinced. It turns a problem about insufficient evidence into an accusation about the skeptic's desires. I think that is a cheap move, and unfortunately, it is a very common one. It misrepresents honest non-belief and allows the believer to blame skeptics for failing to accept claims that have never been adequately demonstrated. An appeal to C.S. Lewis is not an answer. The questions remain: what evidence shows that this God exists, that hell exists, that separation from God continues after death, and that people who remain unconvinced have somehow chosen that fate? Throughout this interview, the pattern is remarkably consistent. When Bartlett asks whether Christianity is true, Lennox describes what Christianity offers. When Bartlett asks for evidence, Lennox speaks about trust and personal experience. When other religions produce the same experiences, Lennox says experiences do not prove anything. And when non-believers remain unconvinced, Lennox says they have chosen separation from God. We have heard enough of John Lennox's apologetics. By now, I think the pattern should be clear. Lennox presents himself as someone trained in logic, committed to rationality, and guided by evidence. Yet in an interview lasting more than an hour and a half, the only clearly verifiable claim he offered was that Jesus existed as a historical person. Instead of giving evidence that Christianity is true, he repeatedly explained why Christianity is worth believing. It gives him hope, meaning, peace, grace, forgiveness, security, and the promise of eternal life. Those things may explain why he values Christianity, but they do not establish that its claims correspond to reality. The double standard becomes obvious when Bartlett points out that people in other religions report the same sense of peace, meaning, and fulfillment. Lennox suddenly admits that such experiences do not prove a religion is true. Exactly, but if they do not validate Islam or Hinduism, they do not validate Christianity either. We see the same inconsistency in his treatment of hell. Instead of defending the justice of a God who allows people to suffer for honest unbelief, Lennox shifts the responsibility onto the unbelievers and says they chose separation from God. But failing to believe that someone exists is not the same as deliberately rejecting that person. It is a weak excuse that protects God from criticism by blaming the people who remain unconvinced. I have often said that this channel is not merely about debunking religion. It is about promoting critical thinking and greater self-awareness. One of the clearest signs that we need greater self-awareness is when we unknowingly apply different standards to different beliefs. Most of us agree that our reasoning should be consistent. So when we catch ourselves accepting weak evidence for a belief we favor, while rejecting the same kind of evidence when it supports another belief, we should pause rather than double down. That is an opportunity to examine our own thinking and cultivate greater mindfulness. My advice on this channel for religious people is not simply to leave religion. My advice is to become more mindful of your own mental processes. Pay attention to how you evaluate evidence, especially when the conclusion is something you deeply want to believe. Ask whether you would accept the same reasoning from someone defending another religion or worldview. That kind of self-awareness will make you a better thinker, whether you remain religious or not. Now, I would like to hear from you. What do you think was Lennox's strongest arguments for Christianity, and what was his weakest? Do you think my criticism was fair, or did I overlook something important? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next one.